The soft clatter of porcelain shattered the pre-dawn quiet. Single father Daniel Ross woke instantly in his rundown Brooklyn apartment. He found a stunning woman standing by his stove, wearing only his faded white shirt. She was the embodiment of Manhattan power, now utterly exposed. She turned, her eyes bloodshot, the CEO persona gone. She whispered, "Daniel, I need you to protect me." This was Claire Voss, the ruthless CEO of the corporation where he worked, a woman who controlled billions, a titan of industry, now stripped of everything and hunted, and now had nothing. Daniel Ross's world was a perpetual cycle of exhaustion. His life was a silent, desperate sacrifice, a constant negotiation with the scarcity of time and money. He worked the graveyard shift as a conference server at a high-end Manhattan restaurant, often not seeing his bed until 3:30 a.m. He then had to be awake by 6 a.m. to get his 7-year-old daughter Emma ready for school. His mornings were sacred, every moment with Emma, teaching her to tie her shoes, braiding her messy hair, fixing her slightly burnt pancakes, was a conscious act of defiance against the corporate world that had swallowed his wife Sarah 4 years ago. Sarah had been a kind, brilliant soul who succumbed to a sudden illness, leaving Daniel with an unbreakable resolve. Emma would always come first. That meant abandoning his high-powered career for a simple, stable routine. "I may be poor, but I'm always here," was Daniel's silent mantra. The neighbors understood this dedication. "He's the poorest man in the building, but the kindest, most present father in the borough," they'd often tell him. At the towering headquarters of Voss Global, where Daniel occasionally worked catered events, he was invisible. He was the man who blended into the mahogany and marble, clearing plates and refilling water glasses. An essential function, yet utterly anonymous. The only time that veil of anonymity had lifted was 3 weeks ago. During a late-night board meeting, Daniel, running on fumes, had stumbled, sloshing coffee onto the hem of CEO Claire Voss's pristine $1,000 suit. He'd braced for the famous icy wrath he'd heard rumors about. Instead, Claire had looked him straight in the eye. Her voice was quiet, devoid of the expected arrogance. "It's fine. Are you okay?" Daniel had replayed that exchange for days. Most people he served only looked through him. Claire had actually seen him. He now realized that the look in her eyes had not been arrogance, but an intense, deep-seated fatigue. The loneliness of a person who carried the world's weight, completely isolated at the top. That hidden despair was now physical reality. Last night, Daniel had found her, huddled and desperate. Her designer dress was shredded at the shoulder, her expensive hair was tangled with city grit, and she was crying silently, shivering uncontrollably. "Miss Voss?" Daniel had been shocked. "You're freezing. What happened?" She looked up, her expression a fragile mix of terror and relief. She opened her mouth to speak, but before a word could escape, the black sedan, its windows heavily tinted, rounded the corner and aggressively slowed down. The car was not slowing to park. It was hunting. Claire gasped, her eyes widening in pure horror, and she stumbled backward, nearly falling. Daniel reacted immediately. He didn't ask questions. He didn't pause for confirmation. He grabbed her arm and pulled her into the relative safety of the building lobby, then rushed her up the fire escape-like steps to his apartment. He was operating purely on instinct, the instinct of a man whose primary function was always protection. Once inside, Claire had immediately collapsed onto his worn sofa, a shadow of the corporate titan. Her anxiety had been so intense that she had fallen into a deep, panic-induced sleep. Daniel had retrieved the cleanest item he owned, his white dress shirt, and carefully covered her before retreating to sleep on the floor next to Emma's bed. Now she was up, standing in the kitchen, a $1 million problem wrapped in a $15 shirt. Emma, drawn by the sound of voices, wandered out, rubbing sleep from her eyes. She took one look at the beautiful stranger, and her whole face lit up. "Daddy, do you have a new girlfriend? She has very fancy hair," Emma chirped, oblivious to the high-stakes terror in the room. Claire's face went scarlet, mortified at being caught in such a compromising, domestic scene. Daniel could only blink, unsure if he should laugh or call a crisis negotiator. Claire's gaze swept over the tiny crowded space, the chipped counter, the vintage coffee maker, the walls covered in Emma's brightly colored, slightly lopsided crayon drawings. It was undeniably humble, even shabby, but it was permeated by the smell of breakfast and absolute security. The look of profound, aching relief in her eyes confirmed it. She was safer here, in this haven of poverty, than she had ever been in her life of unimaginable wealth. As Daniel prepared for the day, his downstairs neighbor, Mrs. Rodriguez, stopped him by the mailboxes. "You brought that woman home last night, Daniel?" the neighbor said, her voice dropping to a serious tone. "I saw the car, and I saw her face. She looked like someone running from the deepest mistake of her life. Protect yourself, son, but protect that little one, too." Daniel only nodded, the warning reinforcing his growing sense of dread and duty. He knew somehow he had crossed a line, and there was no turning back now. Claire's arrival was not a moment of weakness. It was the inevitable shattering consequence of an explosive corporate conspiracy she hadn't been able to outrun. Later that morning, the three of them were sitting around the small Formica table. The contrast was stark. Emma's innocent chatter, Daniel's quiet efficiency, and Claire's barely contained panic. The atmosphere was tight, like a drum skin stretched to snapping point. Claire suddenly placed her coffee mug down. Her hands were shaking too hard to hold the worn ceramic handle. "Daniel," she whispered, her usual commanding tone completely gone. "I can't go home. I can't go anywhere. I'm completely cut off." Daniel pushed a plate of toast toward her. "Start from the beginning. Is someone threatening you?" Claire stared into the coffee, her eyes reflecting the turmoil she was desperately trying to suppress. "They're claiming I committed fraud. $12 million diverted from a newly secured infrastructure fund. It's not just embezzlement. It's a systematic dismantling of my reputation." She was the picture of vulnerability, the powerful CEO now reduced to a scared person in his cramped, warm kitchen. She explained the meticulous nature of the trap. The fraudulent transaction had been executed using a ghost shell company, but all access logs were specifically designed to point the blame at her secure personal terminal. The system logs, which would have shown her innocence, had been surgically wiped hours before the firm's external audit. "I was signing the final merger documents when it hit," Claire recounted, her voice rising slightly. "They called an emergency board meeting. They had the evidence, the witnesses, the bank statements, all pointing at my authorized accounts. They knew I'd never touch that money, but they didn't care. They just needed the scandal. They needed me gone before the next quarterly review." Daniel frowned. "Why you? You built the company." "No," Claire corrected, her eyes filled with pain. "I took over from my father. I was the heir. The old guard on the board, the ones my father always kept in check. They hate that I modernized the firm, that I focused on renewables and tech instead of their old fossil fuel empires. They saw the merger as the last chance to push me out and regain control. They needed a scapegoat to tank the stock and seize power," Daniel concluded, his voice calm. Claire met his gaze, gratitude mixing with fear. "When I confronted them, they threatened to call the SEC, freeze my citizenship, and ruin my family's legacy. They even had private security waiting in the lobby. I ran. I just ran." "But why here, Claire?" Daniel repeated the crucial question. He needed to know the core of her decision. Claire looked at the man in front of her. His hands, though tired, were calloused from physical work, not from signing papers. His eyes were honest, not calculating. "Because 3 weeks ago, when I saw the sheer exhaustion on your face after you spilled that coffee, and I asked if you were okay, you didn't flinch. You just said, 'Yes, ma'am,' and kept working. Your vulnerability was honest, Daniel. And when I was spiraling last night, realizing every friend, every lawyer, and every corporate connection wanted me quiet or gone, I realized you were the only person in my entire life who ever performed an act of simple kindness without an agenda." She paused, tears welling up again. "And for some reason, maybe because your apartment doesn't have security cameras or hidden microphones, I knew I was completely safe here." Emma, who had been quietly drawing a picture of a stick-figure family, slid off her chair and walked straight to Claire, patting her knee. "You can stay with us. We have the best hot chocolate. And Daddy is the strongest." Claire finally broke. She pulled the little girl into a desperate hug, her tears soaking the cotton of Daniel's shirt. "Thank you, Emma," she choked out. As the afternoon progressed, Daniel, feeling the weight of her fear, took steps. He systematically checked the apartment's entry points. He swapped out the main light bulb for a lower wattage one, reducing visibility from the street. He was moving with a quiet precision Claire hadn't noticed before. The actions of a trained security specialist, not a waiter. Then the world crashed in. The small, static-filled TV in the corner, usually tuned to cartoons for Emma, suddenly interrupted its programming. The headline flashed across the screen in bold, terrifying red. "Fugitive CEO Claire Voss suspected of $12 million fraud. Massive manhunt launched." Her face, usually poised, now looked hard and criminal in the news photo. Claire stared at the screen, hyperventilating. "They're going to find me. They're tracing the cell phone signals near the office, near my house. They'll sweep the entire area." Daniel's hand was instantly on her shoulder, his grip surprisingly firm. He was a pillar of absolute calm. "We're not near the office, and we're not near your house. You're safe here." He looked her straight in the eyes, cutting through the panic. "They see a CEO. I see a person. We will fight this, Claire. You will not face this alone." His reassurance was the lifeline she desperately needed. She looked at him, and for the first time in years, the burden on her soul felt fractionally lighter. Later, Hector, the kind building attendant, watched Daniel walk by. "That woman, Daniel. She carries the weight of the world on her shoulders. She looks like the last person on earth with nowhere else to go. Keep your door locked, my friend. You did the right thing, but now you have a major complication on your hands." The following morning, the tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. Claire was pacing nervously. Daniel, after preparing Emma's lunch, finally sat down at the small desk and opened his old battered laptop. The machine looked like it had survived a war, covered in faded stickers from defunct tech conferences. He connected the external network cable and began typing rapidly. The rhythmic, complex sound of his fingers on the keyboard was mesmerizing. Claire, watching him make a complex sandwich one minute and operate with this focused intensity the next, felt a growing sense of confusion. She approached the desk and stared at the screen. Her eyes widened, recognizing the highly specialized environment. It was a Linux terminal operating on a dedicated forensic distribution. Daniel was running low-level data extraction protocols, bypassing firewalls and attempting to reconstruct fragments of a wiped server partition. Claire gasped, her voice hoarse with disbelief. You know system-level code? That's proprietary kernel access. How do you know how to run that?" Daniel stopped typing, looked up at her, and offered a grim, small smile. He finally lifted the veil on his past. "Before Sarah got sick, before I became the waiter, I wasn't just an engineer. I was the lead cybersecurity forensic engineer for Omnicorp, a rival of Voss Global. I specialized in infrastructure breaches and data recovery after large-scale corporate espionage. When my wife died, I was asked to take a 6-month overseas contract to hunt a major threat. I resigned. That job, the travel, the constant threat, the 20-hour days, it's what contributed to missing critical time with Sarah, and I couldn't risk missing a moment with Emma." Claire was utterly speechless. The poor, overworked man who cleaned her company's boardroom was the very genius her firm would have bankrupted itself to hire. The irony was devastating. Daniel pointed to the screen, where lines of code were scrolling rapidly, interspersed with reconstructed data fragments. The board used a very sophisticated multi-layer injection attack to make the transaction look genuine. It wasn't an outside job. The person who initiated the falsified transaction and then surgically wiped the primary access logs had full executive-level override permissions. "Someone with deep intrinsic trust," Daniel stated. He looked directly at Claire, his brown eyes hard as granite. "The evidence is pointing straight at Carter. Robert Carter, the chairman. He was using a shadow account for the transaction and framing you to cover the systemic financial corruption he was running. The revelation was a final, stunning blow. Claire collapsed into the chair, burying her face in her hands, sobbing uncontrollably. But these were not tears of fear. They were tears of justice and profound gratitude. She was finally, truly believed. The moment was interrupted by a violent, aggressive hammering on the front door that shook the cheap wooden frame. "Claire, open this door right now. I know you're in there. The police are en route to your location." A furious male voice bellowed from the hallway. Claire sprang up, her face white. "It's Carter. He must have hired a tracker. They must have found the last place my phone pinged before I powered it down." Daniel acted instantly. He pushed Claire behind him and scooped up a wide-eyed, terrified Emma, holding her tightly. He was a barrier, a human shield. Carter, a massive man whose expensive suit now looked like the uniform of a villain, smashed his shoulder against the door, breaking the lock, and burst into the cramped living room. He saw Claire huddled behind Daniel, still wearing the telltale white shirt. "You have destroyed the company I spent 30 years building, Claire. I will make sure you rot in a federal prison." Carter shrieked, his face distorted with rage. Daniel stood his ground, his voice surprisingly loud and steady. "She didn't do anything wrong, Carter. Your conspiracy is over." Carter laughed, a vicious, scornful sound. "Who the hell are you? You think a poor, pathetic server boy who cleans up my coffee can talk to the chairman of the board? Get out of my way before I have you arrested for obstruction." Claire screamed. "Stop! Don't touch them, Carter." Carter took a predatory step toward Claire, his eyes narrowing in contempt. So you're wearing his shirt. You ran to the apartment of this low-life stranger, the elegant CEO sleeping with the janitor. How far you've fallen." He raised his hand, fully intending to strike her, to inflict one final humiliating blow. In a split second, Daniel moved. Faster than Carter could register, Daniel's hand shot out and gripped the chairman's wrist, stopping the blow midair. The apartment went silent again. The powerful chairman, used to unquestioning obedience, was held captive by the hand of his nameless employee. It was the absolute freeze moment. Daniel's grip tightened, the strength in his forearm clearly defined. His voice was no longer that of the protective father, but of the cyber warrior delivering a verdict. "Touch her again, even a millimeter," Daniel said, his voice dropping to an icy, absolute command that brooked no argument. "And I will ensure the police find your body right where I toss you, straight out the window." Carter, visibly shocked by the sudden, terrifying transformation, recoiled, pulling his hand away as if burned. He resorted to bluster. "I will call the police. You're obstructing justice, you fool." Daniel calmly leaned down, opened his laptop, and spun the screen around, exposing the complex, glowing forensic data. "Be my guest, because right now, I have successfully recovered and cross-referenced 92% of the deleted server logs. And it doesn't just show the false transaction, Carter. It shows your shell accounts, your offshore transfers, and the dates you met the private investigators." He pointed to a specific glaring line of code. "It clearly shows that you, Robert Carter, used your executive override permissions to set the trap. Your career, your life, is over." Carter's bravado completely evaporated. He collapsed onto the nearest chair, his face a sickening shade of gray, defeated not by an army of lawyers, but by a computer screen and a single dad with a secret past. Claire looked at Daniel, her eyes wide with overwhelming emotion. In that moment, she didn't see the waiter or the engineer. She saw the man who had risked everything, his stability, his safety, to stand between her and absolute destruction. It was the moment she realized she loved him, deeply and irrevocably. Just then, the elderly neighbor, having heard the noise, nervously knocked on the door. "I don't know who you people are or what trouble you bring to this building," the neighbor said, looking sternly at Carter. "But I know my Daniel. I know he is a good man. I know he would never, ever let a woman be harmed or humiliated. You leave his family alone." The community support was the final devastating blow to Carter's arrogance. The ensuing hours were a whirlwind. The police arrived and Daniel, using the calm, procedural expertise of his former career, walked them through the data, presenting a complete, airtight case file. Robert Carter was led away in handcuffs, his arrest becoming the biggest news story of the financial year. Claire Voss was not only exonerated, she was hailed as a victim of corporate corruption and a hero for uncovering the truth. Yet when the police finally left and the media descended upon her penthouse, Claire didn't return to the glass tower. She returned to Daniel's small, cramped apartment. The penthouse was a monument to her loneliness. Daniel's apartment was the heart of a home. The next few weeks were a quiet, restorative blur. Claire underwent a profound transformation. She shed the armor of the CEO, embracing the simple, domestic life she had never known. She became Emma's willing playmate, patiently teaching her complex origami, helping with homework, and mastering the art of the perfect French braid. She even surprised Daniel by expertly diagnosing a complicated electrical issue with the old fridge, a forgotten skill from her college engineering days. She and Daniel worked side by side, fixing the dilapidated kitchen cabinets, laughing when they both ended up covered in paint. "You know, Daniel," Claire said one evening, holding a paintbrush, "I had everything, but I didn't know how to fix a leaky faucet or paint a wall. I was functionally useless outside of a boardroom." Daniel smiled, wiping a smudge of paint from her cheek. "You're the best assistant handyman I've ever had, and Emma thinks you're a wizard." One night, the three of them were curled up on the sofa watching a movie. Claire leaned into Daniel, her body completely relaxed for the first time in years. "Daniel," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the low hum of the TV. "When I'm with you, I feel like I'm truly seen. Not the CEO, not the target, not the heir." She paused, the weight of her old title lifting. Just Claire. Just a woman who is safe and valued. Daniel turned his head, his lips grazing her hair. "And I, Claire, I finally found someone who understands the quiet magic of just being present. Someone who loves Emma's chaos and my tired jokes. Someone who loves Emma almost as much as I do." Emma, sensing the moment of quiet connection, darted between them, wrapping her small arms around both their necks. "If you stay forever, Claire, we can get a dog, and we can have 2 parents at my school's talent show," Emma declared, completely serious. Claire laughed, a genuine, joyful sound that brought tears to Daniel's eyes. "I want to, sweetie. More than anything, if your daddy would just allow it." Daniel didn't need to speak. His eyes, fixed on Claire, were enough of an answer. He pulled both of them closer, a silent, powerful affirmation of his choice. The next morning, the outside world intruded. The interim board of directors was on the line, their tone desperate. "If you believe that family is the place you choose and choose again, a place built on honesty, not wealth, leave a comment and type, 'I will live kindly.'" 2 weeks after the scandal broke and her name was cleared, the official plea came. The board, having stabilized the stock and severed ties with the corrupt elements, begged Claire to return. "We need you, Claire. The company is lost without its vision. You are the only person who can restore faith in Voss Global," the lead director pleaded on the speakerphone. "Your salary, your bonuses, everything will be quadrupled. We will rename the foundation after your mother." Claire listened patiently, then gently placed the phone down. She walked over to the kitchen table. Emma was intensely focused on coloring a complicated picture of a rocket ship. Daniel was standing by the stove, meticulously stirring her favorite warm milk. The scene was perfectly domestic, humble, and irreplaceable. She realized what the money and the power had cost her. They had cost her this moment. She took a deep breath. "I don't want to go back to that empty penthouse. That life almost killed me, even when I was winning." She looked at Daniel. That evening, Claire stood before Daniel at the entrance to the living room. The time for whispering was over. "I resigned for good this morning," she stated, her voice strong and clear. "I'm done with the corporate world. It's time to build something real, something that matters more than shareholder value." She paused, taking the biggest risk of her life. "Daniel, I have nowhere else to go, but I want to go nowhere else. If you still have space in this apartment and in your life, I want to stay. I want to build a family with you and Emma." Daniel walked toward her, closing the short, significant distance between the two of them. He reached out, taking both of her hands in his. "Stay," he confirmed, his voice thick with emotion. "Stay. Not because you're scared of what they might do, not because you're running from anything at all, but because this is where you belong. Because you want to be here. And we need you here." Claire nodded, tears of relief and love flooding her vision. She wrapped her arms around him, holding him with a fierce certainty that surpassed any board vote or hostile takeover. From the sofa, Emma jumped up, her little voice full of triumphant joy. "Then I have a new mommy now. Can we get a puppy tomorrow?" Daniel and Claire dissolved into laughter, their tears mixing with their joy, the sound of a new family forming, echoing in the small room. The final, powerful symbol of closure came as Claire meticulously folded Daniel's oversized white dress shirt. The shirt she had been wearing when she arrived a terrified CEO, and the shirt that now symbolized her new start. She placed it carefully into the drawer beside Daniel's other shirts. "The moment I put this on," she said softly, touching the faded cotton one last time, "my whole life changed. You gave me cover, Daniel. You gave me home." They sat down at the table, the small dinner simple but warm, a family chosen not by blood or inheritance, but by a shared moment of desperate kindness and a deep, true love, had finally begun its life together. If you believe stories like this deserve to be told, leave a comment and subscribe. We tell the stories that shouldn't be forgotten,